after that. Um, I don't know, we've been covering up to this point. So we'll start with Assyria. Assyria was based on the city of Assur, an Akkadian speaking city. They were Semitic people, and the Assyrians actually established not one but maybe three different empires during the period we're looking at. Um, and but they're considered in many ways to be the first empire, not just in the Middle East but actually in the world. So under Shamshi Adad, the very first Assyrian empire emerges. That is, he's king of Assur and goes on to conquer some of the surrounding areas. But it's a short-lived empire. It doesn't really survive long after his death. Partly because Hammurabi in Babylon is the king in Babylon. In fact, he forces Assyria to pay tribute to him after the death of Shamshi Adad. And then the Assyrians fall under the for a time fall under the influence and the control of the Mitanni people as well. So the first Assyrian Empire, it's an empire, yes, and that it's an extensive kind of landmass, but it's short lived, and is really more, it's just slightly kind of a an extension of what we've already seen. Ashur-uballit creates the second Assyrian Empire. Again, you can see this is about 400 years after the first one emerges. It's slightly bigger than the first Assyrian Empire, but broadly speaking, the same size. He became king in 1365 BC. This time it lasts maybe a couple of centuries. And so in that sense, it's more extensive than the previous edition of the Assyrian Empire. The second Assyrian Empire, the Middle Assyrian Empire, it doesn't really go into collapse as such like the first one did. It doesn't have an obvious conquest by an outside people. Rather, the Bronze Age world itself collapses, not just in Assyria, but throughout the kind of or the Levant, that is the area to the east of the Mediterranean, kind of throughout that region around 1200 BC. And actually, Assyria, while it goes into some kind of, it does go into a decline certainly, but it does not fare as badly as Babylon or Egypt, for example. Those states are riven by much more kind of upheaval than Assyria is. Um, the third emergence of the Assyrian Empire, and in many ways the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the new Assyrian Empire, starts in the 10th century under Adid-nirari. And this is considered the first true empire, because it's much bigger in scale than the previous two were, and it lasts an awful lot longer as well. So in some ways, I mean, there's a lot of debate about what exactly makes something an empire, but some people would look at the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which means, of course, the new Assyrian Empire, as the beginning point of that. I mean, you can even see, I mean, that the first Assyrian Empire, we're talking 750 years between the first and the third empire. So to you, this all kind of blurs together onto the PowerPoint slide, but this is a significant block of time between the first and the third empire. um, Adid-nirari differs from previous rulers in that he is almost constantly at war. He goes on new campaigns year after year, and that causes people who've already been conquered to kind of remain passive for fear of aggravating him. But also, of course, it expands at a large rate the Assyrian Empire as well. Um, some of the more kind of famous rulers, one is Tiglath-Pileser III. He was a military commander who in the 700s actually basically took over the Assyrian royal family, slaughtered the Assyrian royal family, and aggressively expanded his control over the territory. And then he was followed by Sargon II, and the book is a bit unclear. Well, the book kind of suggests that he was a military commander of Tiglath-Pileser. Other sources think he was Tiglath-Pileser's son. But either way, he also is an expansive military leader who comes to control Assyria by 705 BC. And yeah, just to give you a sense of the scale of the Assyrian Empire, we can take a look. So basically, compared to the first and the second, the third controls much of Egypt, large parts of the Middle East. I mean, that area in the middle there that is not conquered is Judah. But other than that, pretty much most of the Middle East is controlled by Sargon II, who actually was interesting in that he was calling himself Sargon, obviously referring to the first Sargon in Acadia, and it just shows how propaganda and propaganda and the idea of influence, the idea of continuity and legitimacy are important as well. Even though Sargon II had no relationship whatsoever to Sargon I, and there was obviously an extensive period of time between them as well, in some ways he was trying to reclaim the aura of Sargon by taking that name and ruling over Assyria. Okay, so the Assyrians relied in particular upon the brutal reputation of their army as the basic function of government in order to keep these other people kind of repressed within their empire. The Assyrian king and the Assyrian royal family like to think of themselves as representatives of Assur. Assur was their god, as well as their city they originally came from, but the god that they worshipped. And their job was to, I guess, communicate between the ordinary people of the world and the god Assur as well. And they were the ones who claimed to determine what Assur's will was and to follow his orders. So a very kind of top-down system of government was in place in Assyria. The social elite, as we've seen in other cities and states as well, especially in Egypt, it was a combination of generals, priests, and governors who rule and administer over the empire. And of course, only the wealthy aristocratic families of Assyria can get these positions. So we have generals, priests, and governors. Occasionally, you might have someone who would occupy more than one of those roles, but primarily they were individual positions for individual people that oversaw the administration of the empire. The main thing that kept the Assyrian Empire together was roads, taxes, and spies. The Assyrian army constructed roads throughout the empire. And while that might seem like a nice thing, and obviously it did facilitate trade as well, its main purpose was military. That the army could be moved at great speed along these roads and moved into an area where there was potential trouble or potential rebellion brewing in order to deal with it quickly. Similarly, a network of spies was employed throughout the empire to kind of not just keep the people loyal, but also keep the Assyrian high command, as it were, in the city of Assur informed of potential rebellion and potential disloyalty. And so the network of spies, like the network of roads, actually was useful. Just whereas the network of roads was used to keep the army physically in place and on the move, the network of spies was used to gather information. And of course, the purpose of the empire was the gathering of taxes and tribute. And so again, oftentimes using the roads, tax collectors or tribute collectors went out every year. The subject people were expected to pay a tribute to the Assyrian king, and that was facilitated in this way. They like to present themselves as the legitimate heirs of the imperial people who had gone before them. I mentioned that in the previous slide when we had Sargon like to present himself as the heir of Sargon the Great. Another way the Assyrians did this was they liked to present themselves as the heirs of Hammurabi, and in particular Hammurabi's code, which they adopted more or less uh, as it was, but with some changes in place. Generally, the punishments were more crueler, or were crueler, and death was more common a punishment and more crimes than was true under Hammurabi. The Assyrians believed that their the importance of basically a strong population and a big population. The bigger population you have, the stronger the empire you have. And so they often, the penalties for abortion and homosexuality were actually very strict, because those were not believed to be conducive to childbearing. Um, and therefore there was strict prohibitions against abortion and being gay. Um, Also, under Hammurabi's code, women could initiate a divorce from their husband, but that was not true under the Assyrians. That the Hammer that a divorce was permitted to a husband, but it was only a husband's choice, and so we're getting a much more kind of patriarchal society installed by the Assyrians. Um, they force people to pay an annual tribute, of course, as I mentioned earlier on with the taxes. And if they're not paying them, they were often deported and imported back to the Assyrian heartland, where the kind of strict control could be kept over them. But that actually had some unintended consequences. So in the 8th century BC, the Aramads were people who were supposed to pay a tribute. They didn't pay a tribute, and most of their people were moved back to Assyria, but so much so that the Aramad language actually began to replace the Assyrian language as the ordinary language of the lingua franca, or sorry, ordinary language of the people, the lingua franca of the people from that time out. So that was actually an unintended consequence of their kind of brutal policy of deportation and resettlement, that they themselves kind of lost their own language over time. So the one advantage that the Assyrians had over kind of all previous empires was they very much had a military ethos, and a kind of cult of almost kind of constant warfare, if you will. That explained a great deal of their success on the battlefield. So Ashur was the cult of Ashur and Ishtar was particularly important to the Assyrians. They believed that Ashur gloried in war. That's why they had to fight military campaigns every year to kind of honor his bloodlust, as it were. Ashur was the god of war. Ishtar was the goddess of love and war as well. But they both needed to be sated by constant military campaigning, and therefore the Assyrians were more than willing to do so. The picture here is of Ishtar presenting the captives. You can see the captives on the bottom right, to the king. And so this kind of constant need for bloodlust explains at least partly why the Assyrians were very successful. They also believed that anyone who didn't worship Ashur was an enemy of Ashur. They believed that the army was the private tool of Ashur, and anyone who tried to resist it was again to be mistreated and to be killed. When they conquered a city, they oftentimes carried off the other gods, or the local gods, carried off their statues and brought them back to the capital, which was Nineveh, and they were symbolically held as hostages to Ashur then. And of course, they forced the people in these conquered cities and territories to worship Ashur in their place. In order to kind of consolidate their conquest, they built new temples, which had large religious staff, which of course brought about more expense, which required more conquest to kind of feed into them as well. So there was kind of something of a vicious cycle of conquest having to beget conquest, having to beget conquest in this kind of Assyrian model. In other words, the success of the early days called upon success, and again, we're talking specifically here about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but the kind of constant success called upon or called for people to continue conquest in order to sustain the gains that had originally been made. Um, the Assyrians also gloried in murdering people and executing people, and they're kind of a bit unusual in that sense. But they certainly are well capable of making use of the tactic of terror. This image here is just one with the Assyrians planting stakes with prisoners skewered on it. They were very conscious of the effect of this upon their enemies, and oftentimes would engage in massacres and would engage in mass slaughter in order to subdue people in the next city. In other words, they'll slaughter the people in one city to ensure that the next city does not resist. And up to a point, this actually was very successful. Assyrian art glorified these massacres and this torture as well. And yeah, they're almost unique as a people in terms of glorifying not just military success, but torture in particular. There was also the success of the army. The army, firstly, was quite large. It was not made up of conscripts as other armies often were. It was a large professional army. In fact, the Assyrian army at times could extend to 100,000 men, which was simply enormous. Um, and the other advantage they had was that they were often they quite early on mastered the task of iron smelting. So most of their weapons were iron, and oftentimes they were fighting against people who still had bronze weapons. So it was a large army. It was a professional army fighting with iron weapons against oftentimes conscripts, poorer armed or smaller armies that oftentimes simply had no chance against the Assyrians. Um, and of course, it's not just that the army was large and professional, but also it was one of the first truly organized armies that had specific roles for specific soldiers. So they had their shock troops, their kind of main troops that were trained in hand-to-hand combat and oftentimes fought as a unit. Um, they then had a different body of troops that were known as skirmishers, guys who would kind of engage the enemy with either slingshots or archery. But then were also based in chariots, so they could ride away when they got in trouble, and they weren't weighed down by heavy armor. They were the first in the world to develop cavalry units, and the use of military warriors on horseback as well. And also they had an engineer corps. So when entering a city or when fighting a city, they had people who could specifically work on building bridges, or building battering rams or whatever the need is. So it was a large army, a professional army, but also one in which separate sections were designated. And in other words, you were either a professional cavalryman or a professional engineer, and that could kind of explain your success. So the Assyrian program of exterminating various ethnic groups generally failed to promote cultural diversity, and that certainly is true. And here we have a picture of the Assyrian capital, Nineveh. This is during the reign of Sargon II, and it just gives you an idea of the kind of splendor and grandeur in which the Assyrians were able to aspire to. Again, of course, based on the looting and extraction of money elsewhere. So the Assyrians, of course, had an impressive capital at Nineveh. After the death of Sargon II in 704 BC, his successor was Sennacherib, and he actually began rebuilding Nineveh, and it included a double wall over 9 miles in length, with an aqueduct drawing in water from over 30 miles away, and really was a very kind of beautiful city. And of course, the royal palace in the center of the city was particularly striking as well. Then Sennacherib's grandson, Assurbanipal, went further, and he built an elaborate royal library in the middle of the city, and you can see the pictures here. He ordered that every piece of knowledge or every kind of text out there be copied and brought into the royal library, of Assurbanipal. And without this actually gathering of mass text from across the known world at the time. Many records would be lost to us. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, our oldest surviving copy is comes from this library. So it's a very important kind of moment in world history. So Ashurbanipal dies in 627 BC, and at the time, Assyria was the dominant, by far the dominant military power in the world, but its actually end was not far off. And partly it was because of a lack of a clear successor to Assurbanipal. It sparked off an Assyrian civil war between, on the one hand, some of his sons, so Shinsharishkun, the most famous and ultimately the guy who wins the civil war, was fighting against his brother, but also fighting against other generals who had their own aspirations for power, and hoped to take over from Assurbanipal in the same way that Tiglath the Pileser III had slaughtered the Assyrian royal family over a century before this. In the end, Shinshaskurin manages to win the Assyrian civil war. But while the fighting is going on, and because many of the subject people are kind of deeply oppressed by the Assyrians, rebellions break out. The Babylonians and the Medes were two people who, in theory, they were subject people. They were nominally independent, but they paid an annual tribute to Assyria. Once this civil war broke out in 627 BC, they seized that opportunity and stopped paying the tribute. And you can see I have it written here. Nabopolassar was the leader of Babylonia at the time. He stopped paying the tribute in 625 BC, and by 620 they had broken free entirely of Assyria. But they weren't content just to break free. They also wanted to go further and actually attack Assyria. So they made an alliance with the Medes, who also, in a similar position, would have broken off their tribute to the Assyrians. And in 612, they captured the city of Nineveh. Nineveh in 612 BC destroyed the city, killed Shinsharishkun, and the Assyrian Empire by this stage was on its last legs. It did have one ally left. It had Egypt, and the Egyptians basically decided it was better to have a weak Assyria on its border rather than a strong, particularly Babylon. They were looking at Babylonia as a potential rival. In fact, they were looking at Babylonia as simply taking over from the Assyrians. They didn't want that. They preferred the Assyrians weak but still intact. And they tried to go to their aid. Actually, they firstly fought a Jewish army or a Judean army, but they managed to defeat that. They fought them actually at Megiddo, and they wiped out the state of Judah. But actually, that's where the word Armageddon comes from, because it's meant to be a terrible battle that, at least from the point of view of the Jews, set their civilization back a couple of centuries. They then marched on to Haran, which was kind of the last outpost of the Assyrians. But the Egyptians and the Assyrians are unable to defeat the Babylonians and the Medes. The Babylonians and the Medes win at the Battle of Haran in 1609. And that brings an end to the Assyrian Empire quite quickly. And in fact, they kind of disappear from the world stage from there on in. And this is a picture of the fall of Nineveh, and you can see it's kind of otherworldly, almost end of the world scenario. This place of great splendor and a magnificent city falls to the Babylonians and Medes in 612 BC, and then in fact is destroyed after that as well. So now we're going to look at the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabopolassar died in 605 BC, and his reign, he was succeeded by Nebuchadnezzar II, and under him, the Assyrians are actually going to take over the Babylonians are going to take over most of the areas the Assyrians had previously ruled. Although ultimately their reign will prove to be much shorter than the Assyrians. So they conquered the cities, much of the area of the Levant. That is the area of the Eastern Mediterranean, subjecting cities like Tyre to their kind of rule and forcing tribute from them as well. They've also fought with the Egyptians. The Egyptians were trying to resist their rule, but they defeated them in battle and brought them in under their control. So pretty quickly, the Babylonians take over much of the old Assyrian Empire. The one area that they had a little bit of trouble with was Judah. That is the independent Jewish kingdom of Judah, which was governed from Jerusalem. Judah rebelled in 598 BC under their king Jeconiah. It was captured. The city of Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, and Jeconiah was exiled back to Babylon. And in his place, Zedekiah was put in his place. He was supposed to be a puppet king who would do as he was told, and who would rule. Judah would still technically be nominally independent, but would rule as the Babylonians wished. And for a time, Zedekiah did this, but he then decided to throw his lot in with the Egyptians again, who were rebelling against Babylonian rule. Judah sided with Egypt, and this led to a devastating Babylonian retribution, a devastating retribution by Nebuchadnezzar in particular. Firstly, they captured the city of Jerusalem. They captured Zedekiah. They executed his sons in front of him. Then they blinded him and they exiled him back to Babylon. They weren't content with that, however. They destroyed the city of Jerusalem because it had been a rebellious city for several centuries. And they exported not just Zedekiah, but actually a large number of Jews from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas back to Babylon. And this becomes known as the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's actually a pretty big figure in the Bible, but his greatest reputation is as the destroyer of Jerusalem and the Jewish homeland. Actually, ironically, he was quite a builder himself. He rebuilt the major cities of the Babylonian Empire, including Babylon, and many of the great walls, great walls and aqueducts of Babylon were built during his rule. And he also constructed perhaps the most famous monument, which was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which is seen in a picture here. Apparently to please his wife Amethyst. So Amethyst was a Median princess, or a princess of Mede. She didn't like living in Babylon because it was flat and boring, and she was used to kind of green hills that she had witnessed growing up in Medea. And so as a result, Nebuchadnezzar constructed the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That is a tiered system of gardens with greenery kind of coming out at every level, and it was supposed to replicate the hills of Medea. Whether actually the Hanging Gardens of Babylon exist or not, we're not 100% sure. But if they did exist, they were constructed by Nebuchadnezzar. He also rebuilt the ziggurat of Etem Anki, and it was part of a lavish building program that was taking place across Babylon. Etem Anki was a ziggurat that was dedicated to Marduk, the Babylonian god, and it was supposed to kind of honor him and replace, I guess, Asher as the leading god in the Middle East. And again, when he died in, let's say, 562 BC, the Babylonians appeared to be in a dominant position, but actually their collapse was not far off as well. And it comes down to this. So firstly, King Nebuchadnezzar lived in a hanging garden to please his Hutterite wife. Not exactly. The Babylonians honored their gods by building pyramids in the shape of zeppelins. Not exactly. Okay, changing names. Starting in 1935, the state of Persia insisted that Westerners refer to it by this name. And the answer is Iran. So what is today, we today call Iran, for a long period in Western history at least, the state was called Persia. And it's to Persia we now turn, and we turn to this man. And does anyone know who this is? So this is, if you've ever seen the movie Con Air, This is Cyrus, also known as Cyrus the Virus. But we are going to look actually at his historical predecessor, Cyrus or Cyrus the Great, the first emperor of Persia. So Cyrus the Great he was the king of Persia, which at that time was actually a small kind of kingdom that was forced to pay tribute to at first the Medes or the Medians, that it was kind of subject to their authority. He became king of Persia in 559 BC, but he quickly expanded his rule. First, he got he was the descendant of Achaemenes, who was in some ways the mythical founder of Persia, but he goes on to form the Achaemenid dynasty. So Cyrus is a member of the Achaemenid dynasty, and also the empire that he forms is also known as the Persian Empire or the Achaemenid Empire. He gets into a dispute with the Medians, and they go to attack him, but actually he manages not only to defeat them but to overthrow them and to conquer most of their territory. So they had ruled parts of the Assyrian Empire, the Eastern Assyrian Empire, in the wake of the fall of Assyria, but they quickly fall under Cyrus's rule after he becomes king in 559 BC. He goes to war with Croesus, the king of Lydia. There was actually the story is that Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi and wanted to know whether he would win or not if he went to war with Cyrus. And he was told that if he went to war, it would destroy a great nation. He took that, of course, to be a sign that he was going to destroy Cyrus and the Persians, and therefore he went ahead and attacked in 547 BC. But and Lydia, I should note, is the kingdom, and we'll see it in a second in the map, but is today kind of in modern Turkey. Anyway, his decision backfires. He is conquered in turn by Cyrus as well, who brings Lydia into his kingdom. And then that leaves the area to the south, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So you can see here the Persian Empire. It's already extended across the areas belonging to the Medes or Medians and the Lydians. But he's looking at the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is to the south, the purple area to the south, as another area in which to expand. He attacks Babylon in 540 BC. And conquers it after seizing the capital city of Babylon itself in 539 and capturing the king of Babylon, Nabonidus. And Babylon itself, kind of as we saw in the Assyrian model earlier on, had undergone a period of kind of extensive internal conflicts following the death of Nebuchadnezzar, similar to what we saw with the fall of the Assyrians in the previous century. However, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, firstly, it's the largest empire the world has now ever seen, but it rules not just over the areas ruled by the Assyrians, but also extensive areas to the east of that as well. But Cyrus is going to be different, and the Persian approach is going to be very different especially from that of the Assyrians. He ultimately believes that toleration is necessary in order for an empire to govern efficiently, because basically people will rebel if they're pushed too far. The worm will turn if it's trodden upon. So his approach is to not trod on the worm, to kind of treat people with respect and dignity and hope that this will buy their loyalty rather than kind of the brutal oppression that the Assyrians practiced. For example, he allows the Jews who were living in Babylon, who had been forced into captivity in Babylon for a period of 50 years or so, to return home and to establish a Jewish homeland again. And for that reason, Cyrus the Great is oftentimes held up as a great hero in the Bible, because he's the person who comes and kind of sacks Babylon, but releases the Jews as a result of his toleration. And this kind of policy he follows is kind of known as satraps or satrapy. So basically, whenever he conquers an area, rather than insisting on a Persian governor be in place and everyone follow Persian rules, he usually picked a local king or local aristocrat and got them to govern basically upon the principles that the people themselves would appreciate, as opposed to accepting Persian doctrine or Persian kind of gods and things like that. So it's governing with a very light touch, oftentimes governing with a local politician or local nobleman as well, or local king, on the hopes that he could bring in ambitious men but get them to work within the empire, work for the Persian Empire, as opposed to harboring ambition trying to break away from the Persian Empire. So quite different from the Assyrian model that we've seen up until this point. This is the Assyrian Empire under Cyrus. And you can see the Achaemenid Empire, or the Persian Empire. It ends up being the largest empire the world had ever seen up until that point. And what do some people say? The founder of the Persian Empire was Medea. Oh dear. Persian kings kept power by dividing their lands into providences administered by satraps friendly to the king. Well, I'm not so sure about that. The gains that Cyrus had made as emperor of Persia were carried forth by basically his one of his immediate successors, Darius. Now, Darius was actually not related to Cyrus. In fact, he overthrew Cyrus's son, Bardia, in 522 BC. But he actually used many of Cyrus's tactics to ensure that the long-term success of the empire would hold. And basically, it's the Persian model of governing an empire that proves to be more successful than the Assyrian model. So the Persians favor tolerance, the Assyrians favor essentially bloodshed and terror. But actually, it's the Persian model that kind of tends to win out. The Persians were particularly popular. I said they didn't really impose their beliefs upon the people they had subdued. And because they didn't impose their beliefs on the people they had subdued, there wasn't really a constant need for military campaigns, which as a result meant that there were lower taxes because they didn't have to spend all this money on military campaigning, which meant that, of course, there was low taxes on the subject people as well. And they often proved to be quite popular, certainly more popular than the previous rulers, the Babylonians or the Assyrians, who had a much more kind of a model built on constant conquest with the constant need for new revenue streams to facilitate this conquest as well. So they had policies of low taxes, low taxes, cultural tolerance proved to be very popular amongst the people they were subduing. And apologies for my iWatch just went off there. Darius instead uses building to as a way of representing his power and expressing his might as opposed to military conquest. He decided to build a new capital city in what is today Iran, so Persepolis. He constructs the city of Persepolis with a very elaborate royal palace, and again echoing what we've already seen from Nebuchadnezzar and others, building these elaborate buildings as a way of representing power and authority and might. He also he built upon the Assyrian road system. He extended upon the Assyrian road system and extended it further than it had been up until this point. In fact, the Great Royal Road, which ran through the middle of the empire, just that road alone extended for 1,600 miles. So it was quite an extensive project. He engaged in canal building as well, so further improving communications throughout the empire. And also he created the world's first postal system. That's to say, he set up checkpoints about a day's ride apart. He had horses at each checkpoint, and the idea was that mail could be gathered at any one place and sent to the next post, which is a day's ride away, and then another horse would go and ride something to the next post further on, all the way until everything came into Persepolis. So he extended a very kind of efficient postal system was put in place, but of course also that helped the Persians keep tabs on information, and any potential rebellion that could be brewing could be kind of dealt with early on before it got too serious. That to say, there wasn't rebellions never took place. His encounter with the Greeks in particular taught Darius that there were limits to Persian power. So briefly, and we'll go into this actually in more detail in a later class, but the Greeks who were living in Western Anatolia, today Western Turkey, not the Greek city-states, but living in Western Anatolia, rebelled in the 490s. Darius put down the rebellion, but then he wanted to punish Athens, which had aided the rebellion, and he invaded in 490 BC, only to be defeated at the Battle of Marathon. And actually, his son invaded 10 years later, Xerxes, and was also defeated at. He won the Battle of Thermopylae, but was ultimately defeated by the Greeks as well. And so the Persians kind of learned their lesson from that, in that sense, that they're even as powerful as they were, there were limits to their power, and it was best not to pour huge amounts of money into campaigns where the chances of success were not particularly high. So they accepted the Western limit of their power, and didn't try and conquer Greece again. Their model of imperial rule, that is, say, tolerance to local cultures, collaboration with local elites in particular, and getting them to govern in your name was important. And excellent communications through the roadways, the canals, and the communication system, the postal system, were the basis for a successful imperial policy, and actually have been modeled, or sorry, been copied time and again since by later subsequent empires. So while the Persians actually practiced cultural tolerance and religious tolerance to other groups, that's not to say they didn't have a religion themselves. And we can see that actually in the emergence of, so prior to the rise of Cyrus the Great in the Persian Empire, there was also, there was also a rise in Persian faith. So around 600 BC, the various kind of beliefs of the Persian tribes began to coalesce into a kind of single body of ideas under the guidance of Zoroaster, as the Greeks knew him, or Zarathustra, as the Persians knew him. And it was his kind of, he introduces a body of thinking that don't just influence Persians as such, but in many ways influence Judaism and Christianity as well. So what did he argue? Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, argued that there was one supreme God from which all good things came, and that was Ahura Mazda, or the wise Lord. And that everything that was kind of good and kind about the world could be attributed to Ahura Mazda. Where, of course, do bad things come from then? Well, his explanation for that was the existence of Ahriman. That was the source of misery and suffering and all the evil things in the world. Zoroaster argued that Ahura Mazda was actually much stronger, a much greater god than Ahriman. But later Zoroastrians argued that actually they were kind of equal in strength. That Ahura Mazda was about the equal of Ahriman. And this gives us the idea of moral dualism. The idea of there being a good and an evil, a right and a wrong, in constant kind of battle with one another. So the moral dualism, Zoroaster himself actually really wasn't responsible for the moral dualism idea, as opposed to later theologians who come on his path and who basically promote Ahriman to a position equal to Ahura Mazda. Other things that were different about Zoroastrianism, it wasn't really a public religion. Up until this point, we've seen the Assyrians and the Babylonians having their god. It's a state religion. You're either with the state or you're against the state. If you're against the state, you're against the state religion as well. And the gods were to be pleased by various public acts and communal acts of supplication. Zoroastrianism, on the other hand, emphasizes that there's this kind of belief in these ideas was more of a private matter. And rather than the glory of the god himself and the kind of aggrandizement of the god, the people should be working towards truth and justice, privately working towards truth and justice. So this wasn't a state religion in which the state god was the supreme god and everything he was to be worshipped kind of uncritically. Rather, people were expected to privately worship, and the way in which they worshipped was by working towards truth and justice, in particular righteousness. The idea was that on Judgment Day, those who had lived a good righteous life would rise again and live a life full of joy and everlasting happiness. And of course, if this sounds a bit familiar, in many ways the thinking behind Judaism and Christianity originate with Zoroastrianism. Um, in fact, so the ideas of Zoroastrianism have a powerful influence on Judaism and later Christianity, and you can see that this isn't the God who just wants sacrifice and worship for the sake of worship. This is more people aspiring towards truth and justice and living good and wholesome lives. And that certainly has an influence on Judaism and Christianity as well. Zoroastrianism, even its emphasis on moral dualism, is certainly reducing greatly the number of deities that are in existence as well. And the Persian monarchs, Cyrus and these guys, certainly very big practicers of Zoroastrianism. This is to say that the Persians themselves claim to be the king of kings. And on the one hand, that is saying, yes, they are the supreme god, the supreme king over which all other kings are governed. But the fact that it allows for other kings to exist as well, other kings in other nations and other peoples, reflects the kind of cultural tolerance and the kind of imperial diversity that the Persian Empire thrived upon. And in fact, the Persians were very open to borrowing styles in literature, art, or architecture as well. And again, that marks it. The Persians, that was quite different from previous empires. Just to finish up with a couple of questions. So, philosophy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in 4 volumes from 1883 to 1885, was the most significant work of this German philosopher, who is Friedrich Nietzsche. Zoroastrianism was founded by Zorro, of course. This was a dualist religion, so be it. And there were 3 gods, good, bad, and now also indifferent. These beliefs later resurfaced amongst the manatees. So these are I guess sea mammals. The gods later resurface as. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will see you all next week.